A few years ago, I found myself sitting in the same sterile neuropsychological clinic I'd visited years prior, staring at a new set of test results that it felt like a glitch in the matrix.
Okay.
On my first evaluation, my IQ score sat at one level. On the second one, same clinic, same battery of tests, the score had swung by nearly 2 full standard deviations.
Wow. 2 standard deviations.
Yeah. And in the world of psychometrics, that isn't just a bad day.
No, that's a different person, statistically speaking.
It's the difference between being an average guy and being the smartest person in almost any room you walk into. And watching the doctor explain this discrepancy, I felt this deep sense of validation for Nassim Taleb's famous argument
That IQ is often a pseudoscientific swindle.
Exactly. I mean, if a high-end clinical setting can't even produce a stable number for one person over a few years, then this whole idea of national IQ maps ranking entire civilizations, it starts to look less like science and more like, I don't know, a collection of heroic assumptions and just noisy data.
Right.
I was ready to just dismiss the whole thing. A measurement fantasy.
But you didn't.
But then I looked at the actual economic data coming out of East Asia, the staggering decades-long explosion of wealth in places like Seoul, Singapore, Hong Kong. And I ran right into a contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Hanania makes a case that is, I think, increasingly hard to ignore. It wasn't industrial policy or government planning that built those skylines. It was human capital.
The skills, the actual output.
The realized skills, the literacy, the sheer cognitive output of the population was the engine. And it left me in this really strange position. How do you reconcile a measurement process that feels fundamentally broken with an economic reality that seems to prove its core premise?
And that precisely is our mission for this deep dive. You just hit the central tension perfectly. Before we get into the economics, we have to pause on that opening story.
Right.
Because it validates our starting point. We have to acknowledge that the pursuit of a single fixed, magic number like IQ for a person, let alone a nation, it's likely a flawed measurement exercise.
Bordering on pseudoscientific, as Taleb would say.
Exactly.
I mean, for the listener who might not be familiar with psychometrics, that swing of 2 standard deviations, what does that actually mean? I knew it was huge, but in practical terms.
It's massive. A standard deviation defines how scores are spread around the average. So a 2 standard deviation swing means you moved from, say, the 50th percentile, statistically average, to roughly the 98th percentile.
From the middle of the pack to the absolute top.
Right, and that's why your skepticism is so validated. If a highly trained clinician in a controlled environment with a standardized, expensive battery of tests can't produce a stable score within 2 years, then the individual number itself is inherently fragile.
Okay, so let's unpack that, starting with the flaw in the measurement, because my experience really cemented this for me. It suggests treating IQ as this fixed, precise number is it's fundamentally misleading.
It absolutely is. The whole critique is rooted in the reality that the measurement process is just, inherently noisy. When you see a swing like that, it tells you the score is heavily test dependent.
It's not one single thing.
No. IQ scores are composites, right? They aren't a pure reflection of some singular, perfect general intelligence, or G. They rely on various subtests, verbal comprehension, working memory, processing speed.
And the context must matter enormously.
Hugely. Were you tired that day? Were you distracted? Did you grasp the instructions perfectly? Your attention, your fatigue, your psychological state that morning, all these factors create this profound fragility in the final number.
Yet we treat those numbers as if they're carved in stone, like it's a personal trait that determines your whole destiny.
And that is the fundamental measurement mistake.
So if that fragility applies to one person in a quiet, high-end clinic, I can only imagine the problems when you try to scale that up and rank entire countries on a global map.
Oh, the problem just compounds dramatically. The global IQ by country maps you see circulating online, they're built on these incredibly heroic assumptions that, frankly, undermine the entire exercise.
What kind of assumptions are we talking about?
Well, they rely on heterogeneous tests. So different tests given in different places, sometimes decades apart. They use small or, sometimes culturally biased samples.
And they're certainly not done under clinical standardized conditions.
Not even close. Often they involve extrapolation. They'll take a test result from one country and just apply it to a neighboring one based on some shaky demographic parallels. So while these maps pretend to measure something with clinical precision,
they're really just a collection of noisy, inconsistent data.
Exactly. The methodology is You could argue intellectually illegitimate because it claims a precision that just doesn't exist in reality.
Okay, so we accept the flaw in the IQ measurement, but we still have that economic reality. East Asia's staggering success still needs an explanation. If we throw out the magic number, how do we save the argument that human capital drove the boom?
We pivot the entire discussion. We save it by focusing intently on the difference between innate intelligence, which is elusive, and full of measurement error, and realized skills.
Realized skills.
Hanani's core argument, and the one that aligns with long-term macro studies, it doesn't require us to believe in some fixed national IQ hierarchy.
That's a crucial distinction. We're moving the goalposts from destiny to something that's actionable and measurable.
Precisely. The claim you need is much weaker, but is also much more defensible.
What shit?
Simply that countries whose populations demonstrate higher levels of cognitive and educational achievement tend to be richer.
So it's not about what you are, it's about what you can do.
Exactly. This shifts the debate from a contentious, often metaphysical discussion about genetics or fixed intelligence to a practical economic assessment of human capital accumulation. We're talking about measurable achievements, literacy, numeracy, complex problem solving.
And these are things that are demonstrably shaped by schooling, by culture, by incentives, and strong institutions.
All of the above.
So we need an operational metric, something that actually measures these realized skills, not some vague concept of G.
And this is where the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA scores, become the essential operational metric. PISA isn't a test of rote memory. It measures what 15-year-old students can do with what they know.
How they apply it.
Right. It gauges their ability to apply reading, math, and science skills to real-world challenges. So the PISA score is a direct reflection of the quality of a country's human capital accumulation.
Right.
And critically, cross-country evidence suggests this quality directly impacts long-term economic growth and productivity.
That's the link we needed. So what's the magnitude of that impact? Because that's the real economic engine we're looking for.
The evidence is remarkably consistent. Studies show that improving a nation's math and science performance by half a standard deviation, which is roughly a 50-point increase in PISA scores, is associated with an annual increase in GDP per capita growth of about 0.9%.
Okay, 0.9%. That might sound small to some people.
It might, but you have to compound that difference over 2 or 3 decades, like East Asia has done. That results in a massive exponential economic divergence.
I see. So if one country grows 0.9% faster every single year for 20 years,
the economic gap becomes insurmountable. That is the human capital multiplier in action.
A 0.9% annual boost from better realized skills, reflecting a disciplined and effective education system. That's the engine we need to understand. And it's the perfect transition to our regional deep dive. Let's jump straight into the data, because the contrast across the ASEAN region, when you use PISA as your lens instead of GDP, is incredibly stark.
It is. The PISA data lets us move beyond just saying East Asia is succeeding to asking how exactly did they engineer that competence, and maybe more importantly, why is that competence suddenly failing elsewhere?
This brings us directly to what's been called the Vietnam paradox. I read an anecdote about a young woman named Lynn who grew up in an industrial zone near Hanoi. For her cohort, education wasn't a luxury or a ticket to comfort.
No, it was something more fundamental.
It was treated as a survival skill. A survival skill for a nation with scarce natural resources. She and her peers had this immense cognitive discipline. I heard it was laser-focused on PISA-style problem-solving practice.
And that cultural emphasis on discipline and achievement is absolutely key to Vietnam's story. It explains their extraordinary performance. They are consistently high achievers in PISA.
Often ranking alongside developed nations.
Right. Despite being historically the poorest country among all the participants in the PISA assessment, they have a centralized education system. And yet, they outperform countries with far higher GDPs and much greater public spending on education.
That's the paradox we need to solve. High cognitive output with very limited material resources.
It is.
But wait, I have to stop you there. A centralized education system that often suggests rigidity or inefficiency. If they're achieving these results, doesn't that imply some massive structural advantage or maybe a hidden resource we're missing?
It really challenges the assumption that resources are the sole determinant of outcome. Vietnam's achievement isn't just about inputs, it's about the structural and cultural forces that maximize the potential of every single dollar they spend.
Okay.
If we look at the statistical analysis of their PISA scores, the findings are genuinely stunning, especially when you compare them to regional powerhouses like South Korea and Singapore.
How stunning are we talking?
We're talking about an equalization of outcomes that just defies expectations. Researchers did a deep student-level analysis, controlling for various factors, and found that once you account for the differences in socioeconomic background—
So things like family wealth, parents' education.
Exactly. Once you control for that, the gap in average test scores between Vietnamese students and South Korean students in reading and science becomes statistically insignificant.
Let me make sure I'm hearing that right. If you control for the fact that a student in Vietnam likely comes from a poorer family, they perform essentially the same as a student in South Korea, one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
That's what the data says. It suggests the entire gap is explained by economics, not by the efficacy of the education system itself.
That's incredible.
And the analysis goes a step further when they also factor in school-specific differences, things like the quality of infrastructure, computer labs, resource availability within the schools. Vietnamese students perform just as well as students in Singapore across all three subjects.
So Vietnam is achieving Singapore-level cognitive results using a fraction of the budget and the infrastructure. That means the limiting factor isn't infrastructure. It's the culture, the discipline, the efficacy of the teaching.
That's the conclusion. It completely changes how we should view education policy.
It's a testament to cultural grit.
It is a phenomenal demonstration that human capital can be dramatically enhanced through discipline and high expectations, even when material resources are constrained. And this significant gain, it's entirely absent when we look at the comparative analysis for countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand.
They don't show that same equalization effect.
No. Even when you control for socioeconomics, their students don't catch up to the top performers, which sets up a devastating contrast, bringing us directly to Malaysia, an economy aiming for high income status, but whose human capital pipeline seems to be, well, sputtering.
The contrasting reality is worrying. The 2022 PISA report delivered some really alarming results for Malaysia.
It did. The country ranked among the top 5 globally for the largest score declines in all 3 core subjects: reading, math, and science. This isn't just a statistical blip. It signals a quantifiable decline in the nation's future economic competitiveness.
So let's put those score drops into human capital terms. A 32-point drop in math. What does that actually mean for the workforce they're currently training?
We can quantify that loss. The OECD has an estimate they use as a conversion. Roughly 20 points on the PISA scale is equivalent to 1 year of average annual learning.
Okay, so with that ratio.
The score declines in Malaysia equate to approximately 1.6 years of lost learning in mathematics, 1.4 years in reading, and 1.1 years in science.
A year and a half of lost learning in math.
Think about that. Multiple cohorts of 15-year-olds are entering the workforce, having missed over a year of fundamental cognitive preparation. This means entire cohorts are fundamentally unprepared for the high-tech, high-productivity workforce Malaysia is trying to build.
And their scores are falling below their peers in the region too, right?
They are. Malaysia's average scores have now fallen below the ASEAN 6 average. And the analysis strongly suggests Malaysia is underperforming relative to its income level.
So the quality of their human capital is signaling future economic challenges that their current GDP figures might not be reflecting yet.
Exactly. And you see this vividly in this specific skills tested. Only 41% of 15-year-olds in Malaysia could interpret simple math situations. The OECD average is 69%.
Wow.
And even more critically, only 1% of Malaysian 15-year-olds could model complex situations mathematically. The OECD average is 9%. This points to a crisis in foundational cognitive skills.
So why the collapse? I mean, the pandemic hit everyone, but to be in the top 5 globally for decline suggests a systemic vulnerability. It has to go deeper than just a temporary school closure.
The research highlights 4 interconnected drivers, and they created this perfect storm of educational deterioration, revealing both the transitory shocks and some very deep structural problems.
Let's start with the obvious one everyone points to first. The learning losses from pandemic closures.
Right. Malaysia had some of the most stringent and lengthy containment measures in the region. Between 2020 and 2022, Malaysian schools were mandated to be fully closed for 397 days.
397 days.
And partially closed for another 232 days. We can actually model the impact of these closures pretty accurately.
Wow.
By applying the known score elasticities, where a 3-month disruption leads to a measurable drop, these prolonged closures translate to about a 35-point decrease in PISA scores.
And what was the actual decline in math?
32 points. It mirrors it almost exactly. The sheer duration of the closure was a massive initial shock, much more severe than in many neighboring countries.
And then, when learning moved online, the second driver, the digital divide, must have turned that shock into a persistent, amplifying problem.
Absolutely. Moving learning online exposed these deep existing disparities in access. Over 80% of Malaysian learners reported facing issues with internet access, slow speeds, no devices, unstable connections.
So the learning just wasn't happening effectively.
If we measure this using the Index of Problems in Remote Learning, Malaysia's score is substantially above the OECD average and way above regional peers like Japan and South Korea. So those 397 days of closure did not translate into 397 days of adequate remote learning. It created these severe deficits that just compounded over time.
The third factor is maybe the most worrying for the long-term health of the economy, this widening inequality between public and private education.
It signals a failure of equity, which then leads to a failure in overall human capital quality. The PISA data shows the score gap between public and private schools is the largest it's been since 2012.
How big is the gap?
In 2022, private schools outperformed public schools by a staggering 68 points in mathematics.
68 points. That's more than 3 years of average learning time.
It is. It suggests massive systemic differences in resource allocation and quality between the two streams.
And if private school students are maintaining their scores while public school students are just plummeting, that means the system that serves the vast majority of the population is collapsing.
Precisely. Public schools experienced score declines that were multiple times higher than private schools. And this growing bifurcation is fueled partly by wealthier households self-selecting out of the public system, which then strains public school budgets and undermines the whole infrastructure.
It's a vicious cycle. When the state education system fails, the engine that powers most of the national workforce is just fundamentally compromised.
It is.
And finally, what about the teachers themselves? The capacity and quality of the teaching staff? You can have the best curriculum in the world, but if the teachers are burned out or inadequately trained, the whole system just grinds to a halt.
And the system is under tremendous strain. The proportion of students affected by teacher shortages, it more than tripled. It went from 7% in 2018 to 24% in 2022.
A quarter of students.
And at the same time, the share of students in schools with inadequately trained staff increased by 1.5 times, up to 22%. So they're losing teachers, and the teachers they have are often poorly prepared.
But the research suggests workload is part of the problem too. It's not just about numbers.
It is. This reduction in capacity is compounded by high teacher workloads, and they're often dominated by non-teaching clerical and administrative tasks.
So they're buried in paperwork instead of teaching.
The emphasis on administrative work, as opposed to pure instructional time and professional development, is noted to be much heavier in the Malaysian context compared to international standards. It's an administrative failure that translates directly into a human capital failure.
That paints such a powerful picture of what happens when that human capital spark sputters out. Okay, let's pick it back to the success stories. We've established that human capital provides the spark. Now let's talk about how that spark gets multiplied, because the most successful East Asian nations, Singapore, Hong Kong, coastal Vietnam, they all share a common, obvious advantage: geography.
Geography is undoubtedly a multiplier, but it's crucial we avoid geographic determinism. As we said, Vietnam and the Philippines have extensive coastlines too. The key is how that geography is used, how human capital is strategically deployed within that geographical opportunity to connect with global trade.
I recently saw an interview with a logistics coordinator, a guy named Budi, who splits his professional life between the hyper-modern shipping hubs of Singapore and the expanding but logistically challenging ports of Indonesia.
Oh, that's a fascinating perspective.
He mentioned that in Singapore, the geography is almost invisible because the human capital is so dense. Everyone is a specialist in supply chain management or maritime law. He called Singapore the high-tech brain of the ocean.
That's a great analogy, the brain versus the body.
Exactly. But when Budi works in Indonesia, he sees the physical struggle of geography every day. A port is just a pile of concrete unless the people working there have the institutional knowledge to tap into global trade, manage modern vessel traffic, and understand international maritime conventions. He said the real magic happens when Singaporean firms invest heavily in Indonesian human capital, creating a knowledge diffusion that turns the Strait of Malacca into this gigantic, ongoing classroom.
That perspective is so crucial. It demonstrates the synergistic relationship between location and skill. The water's just a highway, but you need highly trained, realized human capital, the people, to drive the car and manage the complex logistics of global trade.
And that idea of strategic knowledge diffusion, That's what underpins these regional economic integration schemes, right? Like the Sojori Growth Triangle.
Precisely. Let's break down the structure of Sojori. This triangle, Singapore, Johor in Malaysia, and the Riau Archipelago in Indonesia. It's all about optimizing that flow of trade and human capital.
How does it work?
The Sojori Growth Triangle, established in 1994 but planned since '89, was explicitly designed for economic complementarity. Singapore recognized very early on that its biggest constraints were land and labor costs.
So the goal was synergy.
Exactly. Linking Singapore's sophisticated infrastructure, its capital, and its high-level expertise, the intellectual capacity, with the land, labor, and natural resources available right next door in Johor and Riau.
So Singapore provides the capital and the know-how, and the neighbors provide the physical space for labor-intensive manufacturing.
Correct. It was central to Singapore's regionalization scheme. Relocate the labor-intensive industries, which frees up Singapore itself to focus exclusively on high-value services, financial tech, knowledge-intensive sectors.
Which requires highly specialized human capital in Singapore and rapidly developing technical human capital in its neighbors.
And if you look at the comparative size, it really emphasizes this difference in specialization.
Give us the numbers.
You have Singapore, tiny at only about 716 square kilometers, but with a dense, highly educated population of 5.6 million, generating an annual GDP of around $310 billion.
Okay.
Contrast that with Batam City in the Riau Archipelago. It's physically larger at 1,010 square kilometers, but has a population of 1.2 million and a much smaller annual GDP of about $9 billion.
So Singapore is hyper-dense and hyper-productive, requiring sophisticated human capital. And Batam provides the essential physical space and labor, often as a tax-free export zone.
And that's designed to facilitate those global supply chains. The geography provides the highway, the Strait of Malacca, but the Sojori arrangement creates the institutional mechanism for knowledge and capital to flow from the high-skilled brain to the developing areas.
And that mechanism is best illustrated by looking at the strategic maritime human capital development. This isn't just theory, this is decades of hard technical cooperation.
For 2 decades, the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore, the MPA, has maintained a crucial collaboration with Indonesia's Directorate General of Sea Transportation, or DGST.
And what are they collaborating on? Is it just general friendship or technical knowledge sharing?
It is highly technical. They recently renewed their Memorandum of Understanding to specifically advance training and development for government officers in the maritime field.
Okay.
Since 2005, this partnership has hosted over 120 programs and workshops that have benefited more than 1,800 officials. The focus is on the essentials for global trade: implementing International Maritime Organization conventions, enhancing navigational safety, marine and environmental protection.
So the Strait of Malacca isn't just a geographical feature, it's a giant shared classroom where Singapore is constantly diffusing its high-level institutional knowledge and technical skills to ensure the stability and safety of the global trade route that both countries rely on.
Exactly. Without this continuous diffusion of institutional knowledge and technical training, the geographical advantage of the straits would be substantially undermined. The human capital has to be there to manage the flow of goods, the environmental risks, the complex international regulations. Geography provides the opportunity, but people provide the spark and the expertise to execute.
So we've established that human capital is the spark, and geography is the multiplier. But neither of those matter if the ground you're standing on isn't stable. The whole system collapses without a sturdy container. Which brings us to our crucial final pillar, the institutional container.
The institutional container, the stability, the rules, the governance structure, is the vital third element. It determines whether that cognitive spark and geographical opportunity can actually be captured and sustained for long-term economic growth.
I mean, a brilliant workforce in a strategically located port achieves nothing if property rights are ignored or contracts are routinely violated. I read an account from a researcher traveling through Southeast Asia, comparing the economic realities of families in coastal cities to those tucked away in the mountainous interior.
Oh, well.
The researcher observed a father in a coastal province of Vietnam who has seen his life improve dramatically because the local institutions were stable, geared toward export, and connected to global trade.
A stable coast provides that connection point for global capital.
But then the researcher contrasted that with the father's cousin living just a few hundred miles inland, where the institutions were dominated by local patronage networks and difficult geography made trade a nightmare.
And their economic trajectories.
Worlds apart. The researcher noted that the sheer intellectual quality of the children in both places was indistinguishable in daily life. It wasn't about what was in their heads, it was about the institutional floor beneath their feet.
That anecdote perfectly encapsulates the core institutional quality hypothesis. Institutions are, fundamentally, the rules of the game.
Formal rules like laws and property rights, and informal ones like customs.
Right, they govern economic behavior. And research has shown they are increasingly critical determinants of long-run economic growth, often outweighing traditional factors like raw investment capital. Good institutions ensure efficient resource allocation and minimize waste and corruption.
But how do we measure the quality of that container? It sounds like a difficult, subjective thing to quantify.
Well, we rely on the Worldwide Governance Indicators, or WGI, from the World Bank. It's a comprehensive, widely recognized index that covers 6 key components.
What are they?
Voice and accountability, political stability, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, and control of corruption. These metrics let economists track governance quality over time and assess its impact.
Okay, so let's apply this framework to the 10 ASEAN countries, looking at long-term growth between 2000 and 2022. What did the empirical analysis find? Which institutional factors actually drive economic performance?
The study yielded some highly nuanced and frankly surprising results that really challenge common assumptions, particularly about what constitutes good governance in emerging markets.
Let's start with the positive components, the essential floor we just talked about.
The results confirm what you'd expect. Voice and accountability, political stability, and the rule of law all have a positive and statistically significant impact on long-run economic growth.
That makes perfect sense. Political stability encourages long-term investment. Rule of law guarantees property rights. These are the basic ingredients for a functional market economy.
Absolutely. A strong legal system minimizes risk, encourages rational resource allocation. These are the institutions that must be prioritized and protected first. However, the study's most crucial finding was the negative correlation of the other components.
Wait, you said crucial and surprising. What about the factors we usually assume are unequivocally good, like an effective government and good regulation?
This is the counterintuitive twist. The study found that government effectiveness, regulatory quality, and control of corruption exert a negative impact on long-run economic growth in ASEAN over this 22-year period.
A negative impact. So efforts to improve government efficiency, increase regulation, and crack down on corruption, all things we laud in development circles, statistically slowed down long-term economic growth in these specific countries. How can that be explained?
This is a vital area for reform and reassessment. The statistical findings suggest that in certain developing economies, the attempt to implement high degrees of centralized effectiveness or regulatory quality can often backfire.
So instead of creating a streamlined system, it creates bureaucratic quicksand.
You've got it. Instead of being efficiency enhancing, the complex regulatory environment can create new opportunities for bureaucratic rent-seeking, slow down necessary approvals, and just stifle the agility that young businesses need.
I see. So it just raises transaction costs unnecessarily. A high score in government effectiveness might translate into more complex, overlapping layers of bureaucracy, more permits, more approvals, more compliance steps.
And while those systems aim for quality control, they can inadvertently become inhibitors of innovation and investment, especially for smaller domestic companies. It implies these areas need a critical reassessment to make sure policies are genuinely supportive, not just cumbersome.
That is a fundamental challenge for policymakers, finding that right balance. It suggests that ASEAN countries have a very specific institutional structure that responds differently to these variables compared to, say, an established OECD nation. They might need less centralized effectiveness and more decentralized trust.
The need for tailored institutional arrangements is paramount. Now, beyond these core indicators, the study also used several key control variables to provide context for economic growth over that period.
Okay, let's look at those. What role does investing directly in human capital play when institutions are factored in? Does the spark still matter when the container is in place?
Absolutely. Human capital investment measured by government spending on education as a percentage of GDP was found to have a positive and significant impact on long-run growth.
So it's a virtuous cycle.
It is. It enhances the quality of human resources, boosts labor productivity. A skilled workforce the kind reflected in high PISA scores, not only uses existing resources efficiently, but also has the capacity to formulate and execute better policies that promote sustainable growth.
And what about traditional investment? Gross capital formation, just building more roads, ports, factories.
Investment capital also showed a clear positive impact. Gross capital formation reflects the growth of tangible investments that enhance productive capacity. This is associated with the efficient use of capital and, crucially, the adoption of modern technological advancements. The more you build, the more capacity you have, provided you have the human capital to manage it.
Now for the final two variables, which often divide economists: trade openness and inflation.
Trade openness, how connected an economy is to the global market, was found to exert a negative impact on long-term economic growth in ASEAN.
Wait, trade is usually seen as universally positive. Why the negative impact here?
Well, while international trade generally offers benefits through specialization and access to new tech, the analysis shows that high trade openness makes these specific ASEAN economies more vulnerable to adverse external shocks.
So they're exposed.
They're very exposed because they're so reliant on exports and global supply chains. Volatility outside their borders, recessions in the US or Europe, sudden geopolitical trade restrictions, it hits them disproportionately hard. This external fragility, in turn, negatively affects their long-term stability and growth.
So global exposure, in their case, introduces a fundamental fragility that outweighs the benefits. And finally, inflation.
Inflation, surprisingly to those of us accustomed to Western central banking norms, showed a positive impact on economic growth in the long run across ASEAN.
A positive impact.
The findings suggest that these countries maintain reasonable inflation rates. It's not hyperinflation, but a managed, predictable level of price increase. This environment makes investment attractive, it encourages businesses to expand, and it stimulates consumption. It also enhances the competitiveness of their export goods by adjusting relative prices, which helps their trade balance.
This analysis just perfectly ties together all three elements of our deep dive. The individual IQ score is too noisy, it's not useful. But collective human capital, the realized skills captured by PISA, is undeniably the spark. It provides a nearly 1% annual growth multiplier.
Absolutely. And geography, particularly the coast and reliable maritime access, is the multiplier. It creates the pathway for that global connection.
And the institutional structure, the rules of the game, is the essential container that either holds and multiplies that potential or lets it all leak away through political instability, a lack of rule of law, or that counterproductive drag of bureaucratic overreach.
That is the synthesis. The rejection of the search for a fixed IQ, for a magic number, is entirely justified by the fragility of measurement. But the profound reality of human capital differences is undeniable. It's validated by the PISA scores and the economic divergence you see, right there in the stark contrast between Vietnam's ability to achieve Singapore-level outcomes and Malaysia's recent decline.
So the success story in East Asia isn't a monocausal explanation. It's not one thing. It's a powerful compounding effect. The most successful nations have mastered this complex interplay. Human capital provides the essential cognitive output, geography provides the necessary opportunity, and institutions provide the stable container, prioritizing rule of law and political stability over excessive bureaucratic effectiveness. The winning formula isn't about some fixed potential, but about the systemic policies in education, governance, and infrastructure that determine whether existing human potential is trapped or unleashed, driving vastly different economic destinies across a seemingly unified region.